So this video is a follow-on to a town hall that we had at the Portland Shambhala Center a couple of Saturdays ago. And as facilitator and co-director, I invited two friends to participate in the conversation. And it seemed to raise a bunch of issues. And I invited people that I was connected to through the Liberating Structures community. And I didn't make much of an introduction, but maybe Howard, you could introduce yourself with a sentence or two, and Milla as well, and then we'll take it from there with some questions that we've kind of been mulling before, but this is a completely informal, like we're thinking together and sharing our thinking with anybody on the internet, I guess. Howard?
Sure. Well, I've known John for about 10 or 15 years in Portland, largely through conversations around communities of practice and online communities of practice. And I teach systems thinking and foresight in the collaborative design MFA program at Pacific Northwest College of Art.
Cool. Milla?
I'm Milla McLaughlin. I know John only from being part of the Liberating Structures convening and having an incredible train ride back from Seattle with him and Howard and some other folks. I work at the Rapid Results Institute, where we really focus on helping communities to bring about real change, and I have a real interest in complexity and systems thinking, and so these questions are really just very interesting to me.
So we had a couple of different liberating structures that we used in this event, and Howard and Milla jumped in and participated, and joined us for a beer afterwards. It was a fairly directed kind of event in some ways, but the theme, the goal was to really get at the question of what is the purpose of our center? What are we doing together? And so we had, one piece was kind of introductions, where we are geographically. Another was where we are in terms of involvement on the path. And then after that, we talked about paradoxes that we hold as a community. And then there was a shift trying to talk about what do we do. There was a little bump there, because as we've been talking, the paradoxes part is very much a community holding some real paradoxes that it lives with. And that's kind of the lifeblood of the community in some ways, is to work with these paradoxes. And then to shift to what do we do was all of a sudden summoning a kind of community, organizational, let's do something organized about it. And then at the end we let's see, I guess that was close to the end. We did a sorting of what are the best ideas and wrapped it up. So I guess my first question for you is, what was observable? We've talked a little bit about community vulnerability and how when an organization brings in outsiders, it's a fairly ritualized and controlled kind of thing. For a community to bring in outsiders like yourselves is a little bit more unconventional and unscripted, and you get to see what you see. And so I'm curious as to what you felt was visible, and what about that? Want to take a whack at it, Howard?
I was enjoying listening to Milla just before, so I thought
Yeah, well,
maybe you would start.
Oh, yeah, sure. What did I see? I think it's the question that you're raising raises all kinds of questions for me, is that living in the paradox and making the transition from living in that to taking action. As we live in complex environments, we increasingly live in those paradoxes, and yet we also want to take action. And there's also that paradox of communities that are focused on deepening their learning, their self, their sort of inner selves, and being compelled to action, and how we do that. I think what I sensed in the community was a fairly, I think the distance between, we're a community whose primary focus is meditation and training about meditation, and there's all this other deeper stuff that not everybody's involved in. That I heard, and I felt that there was still perhaps some division there between that. And I think to come out of that into, so what action we take is really very challenging.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Howard.
And one framework that I was thinking about here is, the classic community of practice framework about domain, community, and practice. And so we joined, Milla and I joined as observers, this group of folks that clearly have a strong community, and each have a devotion to practice. I mean, I'm trying to think about or analyze what we saw through this lens. And unlike myself, I don't follow a meditative practice personally. And if something's being questioned here, it seems to me like something is being questioned about the domain. Given what does it mean to belong to Shambhala, given the changes that Shambhala is going through. And so I don't know, what do you think of it? I mean, this is not something we discussed before, John. What do you think about this? Seeing, what did you observe given this lens that you've worked with?
Yeah, I think the struggle is about domain, and that has a practice. Of course, they're always interrelated.
Yeah.
And, if the domain changes, then some people become outsiders, and the practices of being together and the practices that are the subject of the community shift as well. But, and in some ways, I think that the current struggles were kicked off by community issues, a kind of Me Too kind of thing, and really changing environment about clergy abuse, and then people in Shambhala asking, well, what does that have to do with what we do and who we are as a community? And then that directly leads to, does that invalidate some of the domain or study that we've done? Or, I mean, an alternative interpretation is, well, maybe this is what we've been studying for all along. So this is the best challenge we could possibly have.
Mm-hmm.
And struggling with that in itself is a paradox that's, pretty complex and involves all kinds of discernment of each other, of our histories, of what it is we do. So I guess that really goes to this question of the challenges that you saw on the table. What were the challenges that you saw the community holding.
I wonder whether out of that there is a challenge about what leadership means in a community like this. Because, I mean, part of the struggle you're having is really questioning the guru or the top structure, the leadership, the feet of clay, all of that. But then it did feel to me a little bit that question about what do we expect of the local leadership, and to what extent are we as part of the community taking leadership, ready to take leadership, those questions did seem to me to hang in the room a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the one that I raised last time we spoke is about in addition, what does success look like, given that you've started this, you and Janie have started this program around let's talk, let's get together for these town halls or conversations. What is success? What are you hoping to get? What would success look like, X number of months from now for these town halls? Where do you want to be? What does that mean for this local chapter?
Yeah. And I think there's a balance between throwing that question in the face of the community itself, and then having leadership lead and say, well, this is the question that we really want to address. And I think that we kind of have had to defend this idea that we're talking, and really bring up the idea that we have a conversational deficit, and try to sketch out, well, what does that mean, and how does that affect the viability of our community? And to somewhat ponder whether that conversational deficit has come from a leadership style, or as we go into this more and more conversation, like, well, what are we losing, if anything? Like, we're talking a lot more, but it's not as if the other approaches are without merit or without some kind of logic, and we're kind of saying, okay, we have to talk. And I guess part of that is thinking we have to talk because otherwise we're not going to be together. So that's one answer to your question, Howard, is what success looks like: a community that hangs together and that knows what it's about, and that can handle the paradoxes in its domain, and can handle the tensions that come from that, where different people hold different maybe views or different kind of stances in those paradoxes. Yeah. Go ahead.
Because there is the ground of conversation. There is, so you see conversation as playing that really important role of, therefore, in a sense, being able to hold more paradox and more different positions, because you're creating this net, as it were, of rich conversations.
Yeah, the idea that the alternative to conversation is kind of holding those paradoxes in the dark.
Yes.
And that seems to me to be very fragile.
I was wondering to what extent success would look like not having to have these town halls anymore. putting yourself out of business, as it were.
Yeah.
Because trust has reemerged, and this period of questioning ourselves is superseded, perhaps.
Yeah.
So I think that leads, were you going to say something, Milla? I think that leads to the third question we envisioned here, is about liberating structures and its application in this community setting. So, I guess I'm seeing the organizational side of Portland Shambhala is teensy, and it's almost all volunteers. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
So the reality of this situation is primarily as a community. So we're, liberating structures were mostly developed in the context of organizations where you have facilitators trying to bring more community energy and more kind of horizontal insight and potential out in meetings, so that they're not these top-down kind of everybody listens to the leader rituals, right? So what's liberated is the energy of people in the organization. So then the question is, how does that play out in a community setting? And part of the issue there is that maybe in the liberating structures community, this distinction between community and organization has not been so salient.
Mm-hmm. So for me, that raises the question, when does a community need something that like liberating structures, and which liberating structures they need? So not all of them would be appropriate in that context.
And I think
how do we riff on them for our community?
Right, right. It seemed to me that the 10-15 or 10-25 exercise, where we had bold ideas and then sorted them, has very much an organizational flavor. That is, take ideas from the community, sort them, grade them, sort them, and then take the top 5 or something and act on them. So that's kind of from community to organization. And I mean, the tricky thing is that in my observation for churches and synagogues and meditation groups, that the kind of balance or is very subtle and goes back and forth and almost invisible. It's kind of like we switch from one to the other unconsciously, and that's fine. That's great. The issue comes when you appreciate the fact that community has specific assets and skills that can be offered to an organization, and vice versa. A community without some kind of organization can only go so far. Conversely, there are certain kind of vices that are typical of a community that can hobble an organization, and similarly, organizational vices that can bring down a community. So
the one thing that I've been thinking about is that the prioritization in the 2515 LS process is very explicit. And so if the responsibility and accountability and authority for acting upon what is prioritized is not in the room, or is not clear, and so in a community it may not be clear who has the authority or responsibility. And then also similarly in an organization, if the leadership team is not in the room, if there's a group of staff that is doing this, but it's unclear if we have the authority to make this kind of prioritization, then the facilitator who's leading the staff through this process, where authority or responsibility is not in the room, is just kind of making a muddle a little bit, or could be making a muddle.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the kind of ideas in liberating structures, is to not be phony. That is, to genuinely invite action and genuinely invite real questions. And so I think that's kind of the underlying ethic of the whole thing, is something about genuineness. And you don't tell people you're listening to them unless you organize it to actually listen, and to listen in some way that works for the size of the group, the amount of time you have, the subject matter, all of that.
Yeah. I guess I'm just thinking that sometimes easier said than done. Yeah.
Yeah.
'Cause I've encountered this as well in an organizational context.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, to follow up on this distinction, like, communities have some real challenges listening to themselves as well. And they're that whole process of kind of self-perception can just go off the rails. And a community that lives in denial of some issue or some elephant in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So,
doing that 25-15, you're doing that the other day, and our opportunity to witness was really fascinating. I think in the community context, helped me to think about the relationship of the 25-15 to the affinity mapping, clustering, and dot voting kind of on the design side, and think of it more as a spectrum of potential ways of going through that type of process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder, just sort of building on, I find this idea of the organization and the community sort of interesting, because if you do these kinds of activities and there isn't a sense of, well, at the end of this, we are going to decide on a number of actions and we are all part of that, and we're not just here telling the organizational arm of this thing what needs to be done. So, and I'm not sure that you were really able to get to that stage in the meeting, partly because of the tension that arose, that in the end was very helpful, I think, for the community to look at itself. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure that it achieved the purpose that I think you had with it, of a bit of prioritization.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And, I guess the reality here is that we're going for kind of longer term developmental process, and asking or answering what is our purpose as a community is not going to happen in 3.5 hours.
Yeah.
Well, just to circle back to your first question about what was observed, I think that one thing that we all observed was growing sense of self agency and power. It was a strong few hours together, and I think people left feeling very good. What I observed was my perception of what I observed is that people left there feeling good.
Yeah.
Have you had feedback, John, from participants?
Yes, some. That it was very good, very strong. And, I think there's, in this context, is kind of like, well, what's next? So I guess that's good feedback too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And maybe with that, we should kind of wrap it and finish our weeks here. And, I will post this on YouTube. And if you're interested in checking before it's broadcast to the world, or we just go ahead and share it.
All yours.
All yours.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.